story, which is the opening anecdote in the book. All right, so in the heat of Roman August in 1524, an agent called Labatino wrote to his patron, Federico II Gonzaga of Mantua, with a bold pronouncement. When he returned home from Mantua, he said, he would bring the prince the most precious thing one could have in the world. This marvelous item was not a rare gem, nor a precious metal, nor a weapon of war, but instead a medicinal oil that had been proven to work against poison. This antidote had been created by a surgeon and former friar named Gregorio Caravita, who had used it on plague patients in the hospital of San Giovanni Laterano to great success, or so it was perceived. When asked what it also might be good for, Caravita claimed that it would cure any poison taken into the body. These claims were quickly brought to Pope Clement VII, who decided to have the oil tested. He commanded his medical personnel to try it on 2 criminals who had been condemned to death. Led by the Pope's personal physician, Paolo Giovio, the doctors gave both prisoners a good quantity of a deadly aconite called Nepellus, enough to kill not merely 2 men, but 100, in Labatino's words. As the poison took effect, the prisoners started to gesticulate wildly and cry out from the pain in their hearts. Immediately, Caravita anointed one of them with some of the oil, and the man's heart and pulse quickly returned to normal. The other prisoner, who was given no antidote, died in great agony. A second test of the oil on a Mantuan criminal poisoned with arsenic yielded similar results. Labatino boasted that Giovio had promised him a sample of the antidote to bring back to Mantua. He also noted that Caravita knew how to make the oil and might be willing to pass it on for a price. So word of this event spread quickly. Less than 2 weeks later, a 4-page pamphlet appeared in print, described as a testimony of the most true and admirable virtues of a composite oil against plague and all poison, of which, on the command of the Supreme Pontiff Clement VII, an experiment was conducted by distinguished men in the Roman Capitoline edifice. So this was written in Latin and addressed to all good mortals, although of course only some mortals would be able to read Latin. And it was signed by the 3 people sort of most involved in conducting the test: the Roman Senator Pietro Borghese, who was in charge of executions, the physician Paolo Giovio, and also the papal pharmacist Tommaso Bigliotti. And Clement VII himself had ordered its publication. So from this pamphlet, we learned that the first test of Caravita's oil involved 2 Corsicans named Gianfrancesco and Ambrogio. The medics gave them marzipan cake poisoned with aconite, and there's a very long description of where they got the aconite from in the Apennine Mountains and how they made these marzipan cakes. Caravita then anointed Gianfrancesco with the antidote oil, while Ambrogio was given no antidote because he was the more savage of the 2. So there's sort of a moralistic background to this. Ambrogio suffered for 4 hours before he died. And Gianfrancesco, after his impressive survival, was sent to the slave galleys instead of being executed, which was intended as a reward, though possibly a somewhat dubious one. The testers then wished to see if the antidote worked against other poisons, not just Nepellus. So they obtained permission to conduct a test on a Mantuan man named Antonio, who was convicted of murder, who drank a swill of raw eggs mixed with sugar and arsenic. This time, Giovio, Bigliotti, and Borghese administered the poison and the antidote with their own hands to make sure that Caravita was not tricking them in some fashion. This second test, too, was successful, and like Gianfrancesco, Antonio was sent off to the slave galleys. The pontiff then granted Caravita a substantial sum of money as a reward. So these 2 accounts put together leave little doubt that in early August 1524, Pope Clement VII and his personal physician devised a test using deadly poison on human beings to see if they could be cured. The event appears to have all the quintessential elements of the darker side of Renaissance Italy: poison, violent prisoners, cruel popes, greedy princes, and Mantuan spies. We might be tempted to call it the case of the poison marzipan and relegate it to the files of historical oddities, as some historians have already done. Yet the test of Caravita's oil had a significance that when far beyond Pope Clement's fear of poison and his power over those condemned to die. It provides very early evidence of contrived experiments conducted on human test subjects by respected medical professionals. Giovio, Bigliotti, and Borghese not only signed the public pamphlet announcing the success, they also specifically claimed the report was true and presented it as a significant and valid medical finding. This test was also witnessed by an ambitious young physician, Pietro Andrea Mattioli, who ended up being one of the most central figures in my book, somewhat to my surprise. Mattioli was a student of Caravita's at the time. 2 decades later, he included a description of this poison trial in his Commentaries on Dioscorides, which was one of the most influential medical books in the 16th century. It was originally published in Italian, but translated into various European languages, and I've listed them all here on this slide. And Mattioli constantly updated the book throughout his life. So there are a number of Italian editions and a number of Latin editions, a couple of different French editions. So he was constantly adding information to it. But from the very first edition, in his section on aconites, Mattioli used the trial of Caravita's oil as evidence of the herb's toxicity. Its appearance in the work of the respected Mattioli spread word of Clement VII's antidote test far and wide, especially after it was translated into Latin in 1554, and reinforced its medical legitimacy. By 1540, a few copycat trials had already sprung up in other parts of Italy, all testing derivatives of Caravita's oil and all involving a member of the clergy. So a couple of different cardinals tested it. So these are clearly tests that were derivative of Pope Clement VII's test that passed through networks of discussion among the upper echelons of the Italian clergy. After the publication of Mattioli's book, however, poison trials spread around Europe and expanded to include other antidotes, not just these antidote oils. So between 1524 and 1600, over a dozen documented poison trials on condemned criminals took place in Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, with allusions to many others. These tests on condemned criminals always took place at the command of a powerful prince, pope, or cardinal, and they were all conducted by prominent physicians or surgeons. So my book tells the story of these poison trials. It focuses on these tests both as a mirror of Renaissance medical practice and as an important crucible for ideas about evidence, authority, and proof. So for the rest of my time today, I want to do 2 things. First, I just want to present the main ideas and arguments of the book as a whole. And then I would like to delve a little deeper into 2 of the book's chapters. So in developing and carrying out these trials, physicians devoted careful attention to method and wrote detailed experimental reports. So my first argument is that antidote trials generated extensive engagement with experimental thinking. So it's significant that this produced such an amount of writing because they provide rare examples of contrived trials to test drugs, what we might now call an experiment. And I'm using the phrase experimental thinking to sort of signify this kind of experiment before it was really called an experiment. The language around experiment in this time period was very vague. There are a number of different terms used to describe this kind of event that I'm looking at. I'm calling them poison trials. The word trial was used quite frequently to describe these, but also experiment, also experience. There are a few others that are slipping my mind now, but the language is very imprecise to describe this kind of event. But it's significant that this kind of event, a contrived experience using poison, took place because in general, it was viewed as very difficult and unreliable to test drugs through this kind of contrived experiment. The predominant medical theory was the idea of the 4 humors, as most of you have probably heard of, which meant that each person had an individual balance of humors that was normal for them. That meant that different drugs would act differently in different people. So if you had if blood predominated in you, and so you're a sanguine temperament, you would use different drugs than someone who had black bile predominating and was a melancholic. So it was really hard to test drugs. You just had to know their properties so you knew how to fit them into this system. Drugs are usually tested by observation on ill patients at this time period. And it's a very descriptive system involving case studies for the most part. All right. But poison was an exception. It was seen as working a bit differently than other kinds of substances. So the theories of poison began to coalesce throughout the early Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, and early modern period. A historian named Fred Gibbs has written a really helpful book describing how theories of poison changed over this time period. But it was viewed that rather than working within the four humors, so some poisons did work within the four humors, but another entirely different explanation was developed in which the whole substance of the poison would affect the whole substance of the body. And this theory was called total substance or specific form. And it would especially affect the heart. So the poison was seen as going particularly towards the heart, but it was basically something that completely circumvented the Galenic medical system. This explained why a very small amount of poison could affect the body so significantly, and also why poison affected people of completely different humoral complexions completely the same way. So how everything seemed universally applicable. It also meant, however, that poison and its antidotes were easier to test because it worked the same on everyone. So poison had long been viewed as particularly testable. The subject either lived or died. So pretty simple. So testing of poison antidotes on condemned criminals was something mentioned in some ancient sources, quite a few ancient sources. Most famously, King Mithridates VI Eupator, King of Pontus, was known for using both self-testing, but also testing on condemned criminals to develop his famous poison antidote called Mithridatium. So he's most famous for taking small quantities of poison every day to kind of build up, what he thought was immunity against them, but also testing antidotes against it. But he also, which is slightly less known, used condemned criminals for this purpose. And in his commentaries on Dioscorides, Mattioli, this 16th century physician, specifically mentioned the tests that Mithridates had carried out on condemned criminals. So he's deliberately drawing on this ancient precedent, which in the Renaissance was quite fashionable to draw on the ancient authorities. In addition to Mithridates, the Greco-Roman physician Galen, on whom so much of Western medicine was based at the time, also wrote about testing antidotes. I should mention that this text on theriac to Piso that I'm going to talk about briefly here was attributed to Galen. Historians have gone back and forth about whether Galen actually wrote it. The most recent evidence seems to suggest that it was probably a student of Galen's, but that doesn't really matter for our purposes because all of the people who I'm examining in the Renaissance thought that Galen wrote it. So there's assuming that this is a Galenic text. In any case, this text on theriac to Piso noted that it was taboo to conduct fatal tests on human beings, or potentially fatal tests on human beings. So to show the efficacy of the drug theriac, which became one of the most popular drugs into the 19th century, Galen conducted tests on roosters, and he divided them into a group that received the theriac and a group that did not. And he described how he allowed the roosters to be bitten by poisonous beasts, and then those who had theriac would survive, and those who didn't have theriac would die. So you find versions of this text in medical texts that were written in the Islamic Empire, and then from the Islamic Empire, they creep into the Latin Middle Ages in Europe. So this idea of having tests on animals that use poison, and particularly theriac, as an antidote, is something that is definitely a thread, a very small one, but a thread in the textual tradition that goes into the Middle Ages. And Mattioli noted this text too. So he mentioned this test specifically in his book, how the physicians of ancient Rome made test trials of theriac. Galen would have been horrified actually by this description, because he specifically said that physicians did not use tests to devise the drug, that they used their intellect, knowing what all the ingredients were and how they would fit together, that's how they created it. But in sort of describing these tests, Mattioli is making a much more empirical argument about it. In any case, in the 16th century, physicians serving at princely courts reintroduced the use of condemned criminals for testing antidotes. But they added a new twist. Many of them wrote very detailed reports about these tests. So it's not just a short mention like we had previously, they're very long explanations. And so I argue that 16th century physicians used the idea of poison as particularly testable, which was a long historical trend, to conduct contrived trials on human subjects, which they viewed as producing meaningful results. Yet my second argument is that learned doctors did not create these poison trials in a scholarly vacuum. They were well aware of a different kind of poison trial that was already gaining steam. Vibrant marketplace shows by mountebanks and charlatans who sold antidotes and cure-alls through dramatic displays of self-poisoning or poison demonstrations on animals in the marketplace. So this was a time period with a huge variety of medical practitioners. Physicians are certainly not always top on everyone's list of who to go to for a cure. So this was the time when physicians were really trying to separate themselves from other kinds of practitioners. And yet they were also very interested in doing these poison tests. So I argue that physicians use these poison trials to deliberately portray them as learned experiments in order to contrast them to charlatans' marketplace poison shows. So that's part of the reason why they make such careful notes and are writing everything down. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the second part of my talk. At the same time, they could never escape the marketplace. They were always watching what empirical practitioners had to offer. So Paolo Giovio, Pope Clement's physician, tested drugs hawked by the lower class empiric Caravita. Mattioli created and sold his own alchemical poison antidote, which he called scorpion oil, which I saw a question in the chat about what was in Caravita's oil. And Mattioli claimed that his scorpion oil was in fact a version of Caravita's oil. And it involved basically boiling a bunch of scorpions in hot oil and then adding a bunch of other ingredients and then distilling it. So it was all an alchemical remedy that involved live scorpions. This is just a stock image, obviously. Many others also eagerly sought and sometimes even advertised new wonder drugs with claims of success that to our ears sound very far-fetched. So my book aims to blur the lines that physicians tried and failed to draw around their practice. So finally, I argue the experimenters were forced to take into account the limitations of using humans for deadly tests, a kind of early medical ethics centered on cultural and religious norms. Previous historical scholarship has given little attention to humans as experimental subjects before the 18th century. So the 18th century is always seen as sort of a turning point. But there's been a lot of literature on the use of cadavers for anatomical investigation in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And it's well known that this convention faced a lot of resistance from local populaces. Using living criminals to test poison was even more complicated than using dead ones for dissection, I argue. And testers used a variety of devices to make the practice acceptable. This was far from modern medical ethics. There was little concern with the gruesome effects of the tests. Nevertheless, the testers devoted surprising attention to the narrative surrounding human experimentation, and I'll delve a little bit more into this point in the second half of my talk as well. So you might be wondering what all the fuss about poison was in the first place. So the reason why poison was so important is really twofold. First, the more obvious one maybe to you, the concern about malicious poisoning was always a problem throughout history, I guess I could say, of most periods of history, but particularly in the Renaissance. And cures for poison were just important for princes to feel like they could sort of defend themselves against their enemies. But a second reason, which I think was just as important, was that poison was viewed as an underlying cause of epidemic diseases and especially plague. So I mentioned that the way that poison operated helped explain why people could be affected by poison who had all sorts of different humoral complexions. Well, the same was true of plague. So plague also affected people of a variety of complexions. So poison was used as an explanation for plague and then expanded to include also other epidemic diseases that affected a large number of people in similar ways. So a cure for poison could therefore be a cure for plague and other diseases, which to any Renaissance prince would have been just as valuable as protection to himself, because he could help protect his people. And note that Caravita first came to Pope Clement's attention because he claimed to have successfully cured many plague patients. There was a long tradition of poison antidotes as cures for diseases more broadly, and the ancient antidote theriac was a prime example. But as time went on, there was additional ones really became more and more popular. So unicorn horn and bezoar stone were animal products viewed as good against poison, but also other diseases. And I know Chris Stuffen has written about both of these. And as the Portuguese expanded into South Asia, bezoar and other items sold as unicorn horn, so usually rhinoceros horn or narwhal tusk, became more affordable. They were still very expensive, but they were much more accessible than they had been previously. And with the Spanish colonization of the Americas, hundreds of potentially useful drugs poured into Europe and led to an unprecedented collaboration between physicians and merchants. Some of these drugs were remedies for specific diseases or specific purposes, but others were touted as near panaceas that could, among other things, cure poison. The most famous example is tobacco, which was described as a panacea herb in a Dutch publication from 1587 and counted anti-poison properties among its many virtues. So there was a close tie between both poison antidotes that could more broadly be seen as wonder drugs and wonder drugs that had poison fighting properties as part of their wondrous properties. New cure-alls also emerged from a separate tradition, the practice of alchemical medicine and distillation. So a flourishing interest in distillation in the 16th century led to a boom in new alchemical cures. Many of these drugs were viewed as near cure-alls, and like poison antidotes, they were assumed to work universally on all bodies. So in sum, there were a lot of new drugs, which also helped the impetus towards testing, because there was a lot of new drugs to sort through. And there was a real drive to figure out what worked, or to, if you were marketing the drugs, to advertise that your drug worked. So Renaissance individuals, from what I found, were almost never testing the ancient antidote theriac, which had been the focus of most testing to that point. They were testing all of these other newer remedies. So my book traces poison trials and their wider meaning over the longue durée from ancient Greece into the 17th century, with a main focus on events in the 16th century. So I take a pan-European approach. I draw in examples from around Europe and its colonies, but the bulk of evidence comes from Renaissance Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. The way I've organized it is that each chapter I pick an antidote to have as its center. So I begin with a discussion of Caravita's oil that I've introduced to you as well. I broke the book into 3 sections. The first part on authorities, the second part on experiments, the third part called wonder drugs. The first section focuses on precedents for poison trials. So the background in some of the background that I've laid out for you a little here in Greek and Roman sources in the Middle Ages, and the real focus on poison as a particularly testable substance. The second chapter looks at the trial of Caravita's oil more closely and the background of anatomical dissection as context for the development of poison trials, and also the way that Caravita's oil trial engendered additional trials in Italy under Catholic authorities. Chapter 3, which I will discuss in more detail presently, looks at Mattioli's role in spreading poison trials around Europe, and examines poison trials as learned experiments. Chapter 4 examines that case I found in the archive in Neuenstein as a lens on a sort of early medical ethics. I'll hear more about that in a minute. Chapter 5 examines poison antidotes as valuable commodities that were part of the drug trade and the way that impacted different methods of testing. And chapter 6 looks at one enterprising alchemist who confounded physicians with a poison antidote that he specifically called a panacea. And he specifically highlighted patient testimonial letters as better proof of efficacy than poison trials. So the whole book basically asks questions about what counted as proof of a cure and how physicians negotiated their own authority around that question. Okay, so now I'd like to delve into the couple of the chapters of my book. I'm going to focus on the middle section on experiments. So I will talk a little bit about chapter 3, which talks about drugs, these poison trials as medical experiments. And then I will give some bit of chapter 4, which focuses on the question of medical ethics. So chapter 3 begins with a failure. It describes how in 1561, a group of physicians gathered in Prague Castle to observe a soldier condemned to be hanged for thievery take a dose of poison followed by an antidote. The test had been ordered and the criminal granted by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I. And it aimed to see whether a special powder against poison created by the emperor's son, Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol, could overcome the deadly aconite Nepellus. So you once again here see Nepellus appearing as a particularly feared kind of poison. The famous physician Pietro Andrea Mattioli led the proceedings. As the doctors looked on, the prisoner ate a dram, which is about 4 grams, of powdered Nepellus root mixed with rose sugar. And then nothing happened. After an hour and a half sitting in a warm room, probably making very awkward small talk, the prisoner still felt completely fine. The physicians speculated that the problem lay in the Bohemian Nepellus they used, which they thought was perhaps less potent owing to the colder climate than the Mediterranean Nepellus described by the ancient authorities they were reading. So they decided to give him a second dose, and they waited another 2 hours and the prisoner still felt fine. So the physician sent him back to his prison cell and went home. An hour later, a prison guard alerted Mattioli that the prisoner had started to feel poorly. Mattioli rushed back. Although the prisoner still claimed he felt fine, Mattioli could tell from the cold sweat on the man's brow and his fading pulse that the poison was working. So here he's describing how he used his physician's expertise to come to this diagnosis. He gave the prisoner a dose of the antidote mixed with wine. Immediately, his eyes rolled back in his head. He thrashed about and grabbed his throat, and he would have fallen if the prison guard had not grabbed him. Mattioli surmised that the poison and the antidote were fighting, and the prisoners proceeded to suffer some very unpleasant effects, mostly evacuations from both ends. I'll spare you the details. And eventually said he felt a little bit better, but then lay down on the straw in his cell and died. So we know about this event in such detail because Mattioli himself wrote it down. He added it to the 1563 edition of his book and all later editions after that. One of the many interesting twists to this case is that Mattioli was a personal physician to Archduke Ferdinand, whose powder was being tested. He thus committed to writing and to print an abject failure of his own patron's poison antidote. So the question I asked going into this chapter is, why would he do this? Why would he sort of explain in such excruciating detail that his patron's antidote had failed to overcome the poison? So I argue that the outcome was less important to Mattioli than the process. Mattioli described the effects of the poison and the antidote in ways that conformed with accepted medical theory. It first affected the heart, then moved to the stomach and the intestines. And the failure to merely confirmed existing scholarly opinion. According to Mattioli, the inability of the archducal poison powder to prevent the prisoner's death had nothing to do with the powder itself, which he said might have just been an old batch. It wasn't the powder's fault. Instead, it reinforced the toxicity of the poison, which he said proved the correctness of ideas about aconite written by Avicenna, one of the most iconic Arabic physicians who Mattioli in general follows very closely. So poison trial in this telling were a scholarly enterprise conducted in the footsteps of learned medical tradition. So all very scholarly and above board. So there is a foil for this depiction, and I'm coming back to the theme of charlatans that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. In a different part of his commentary, Mattioli contrasted learned physicians' poison trials with another less legitimate kind of testing. He warned his readers to guard themselves against counterfeit theriac sold in the piazza by snake charmers. These dishonest deceivers used all sorts of deceptive tricks to appear to test their pseudo-theriac in public and hoodwink many vulgar ignorants, as he said. Directly after this criticism, however, Mattioli advertised his own oil of scorpions, which I've already mentioned. So there's this like real cognitive dissonance from this complete diatribe against empirics doing poison tests in the marketplace to describing his own scorpion oil, which he mentioned had been tested in this trial of Caravita's oil. And he said, go back and read this, this trial in this section of my book if you want to know how it happened. So this points to a major problem for Mattioli and other physicians. How to distinguish physicians' poison trials from the tests conducted by lower class empirical practitioners, known varyingly as snake charmers, mountebanks, theriac peddlers, empirics, charlatans, and other derogatory names. It was standard practice for physicians to criticize these healers, but it was something else entirely for them to conduct tests that to the neutral observer might appear vaguely similar. So to set themselves apart from these lower class empirics, physicians developed a model for a learned poison trial. This model involved both methods of testing and strategies of communication that presented a direct contrast to mountebanks' marketplace shows. In doing so, they explicitly cast experiment as a scholarly endeavor. So some of these things they always included signs that the poison had taken effect. So they described the symptoms and that the poison was causing. The symptoms that the poison suffered, which ran the gamut: pains, nausea, vomiting, usually a cold feeling. Often poison was seen as bringing cold with it. The time of day that this happened. So specific time markers, often very direct ones, as we'll see in a minute. And then the state of the prisoner, if the recovery if relevant. So did the recovery last? They also frequently use things like pulse, like what did the prisoner's pulse feel like? What did the prisoner look like? So they're using all of these things that were very much part of learned medical practice and writing them out in great detail. Mattioli was not the only person to document poison trials. Emperor Ferdinand's surgeon, a man named Claudius Ricardus, also described 2 other poison trials at Ferdinand's court right around the same time, both of which aimed to test bezoar stone, which some of you may remember from Harry Potter. One, but is a sort of calcified and a byproduct of digestion found in the stomach of some animals. The most prized bezoar stone came from Persian mountain goats at the time period. So Emperor Ferdinand, before there was a big sort of bezoar boom towards the end of the 16th century, but even before that, Emperor Ferdinand had acquired some and he wanted to test it. So this test that was conducted by Claudius Ricardus took place just after Mattioli's failure. And you can see a direct relationship between the two tests. So like Mattioli's test, it used Nepellus as a poison. It just used a different antidote. The exact same dose of Nepellus was given as in the failed trial, the initial dose in the failed trial. This time, however, food was withheld from the prisoner, and it was specifically said so that his body would be more open to the poison. And this point was mentioned repeatedly throughout Ricardus's account of the trial. In this case, the poison worked right away and the prisoner lived. Ricardus also described a second case in which it was a sort of very similar description, except that not only was food withheld, but the prisoner was also not allowed to sleep the night before. So they're clearly manipulating in quite horrific ways, obviously, the prisoner's bodies ahead of time to try to make the poison more effective and thus the experiment work better. There's also a particularly interesting case in physician's records in the Strozzi archives in Florence, which tested Cosimo de' Medici's poison powder, so a different poison powder. You can see that he was testing a man who was condemned to death, who was in the Bargello prison waiting to be executed. He was given 2 grams of arsenic in order to test Cosimo's poison powder. So this one is particularly interesting because of how carefully they mentioned time markers. So the prisoner took the arsenic at 12 hours, 3/4 of an hour afterwards, he began to feel bloating in his body with a slight pain. The physicians took his pulse, found it very rapid, thought the poison had not quite taken effect. 14 1/3 hours, he complained of a bitter throat, and the doctors found his pulse weaker. Half an hour later, he complained of an internal coldness in his stomach, and the doctors found his pulse again much weaker and decided to prepare the antidote. So I won't give you the gory details of what happened then, but the physicians recorded every instance, always with careful time markers and checks for the pulse. And this back and forth went on for several days. They had to give the antidote multiple times. They never actually recorded what happened in the end. So whether the prisoner lived or died, they sort of leave vague. And really the report is more about how poison affects the body and the antidote following it than it is about whether this antidote was successful or not. So part of my argument in this chapter that from the physician's point of view, the question of what happens when poisons and antidotes are given to a human body is actually more important than does the prisoner live or die. They're interested in sort of the intellectual question of it more than whether this antidote works or not. A final case that I discussed in this chapter, which is a nice segue to the next chapter, took place not on humans, thankfully, but on dogs at the court of Landgrave Wilhelm IV of Hesse-Kassel. And in this case, it was quite extensive. So the physicians took 8 dogs and 4 poisons. They tested the dogs in pairs, and for each pair, both dogs got the same amount of poison, but only one got the antidote. And then it turned out that all dogs who received the antidote survived, and those who did not died. So this all seems like it's very well thought out. It's important to note, however, that the antidote in this case came from an empirical practitioner, a man named Andreas Berthold, who came to Wilhelm to offer his antidote for sale. So again, it's a commercial empirical practice that's sort of driving this test in this case. We know about it partially from a printed report that Berthold included in his book, and Berthold specifically asked for this testimonial letter to include as kind of a marker to help him sell his drug. So while these detailed reports were meant to separate physicians from empirics, it was always hard for physicians to draw clean lines. But this case of the Dog trials also shows that reports of these poison trials were read with interest, because not only do we have this printed account that Berthold published, but there's also handwritten accounts in a few archives in Germany. This particular one was somehow found its way into the hands of Countess Palatine Elizabeth of Saxony, and is included among her papers. And somehow, possibly via Elizabeth, it also found its way into the hands of Countess Anna of Hohenlohe, who was a close friend of Elizabeth's. So Anna bought some of Berthold's Terra Sigillata on the strength of this report on the dog trials. And as we will see, this engendered the poison trial that forms the center of my fourth chapter, which is exploring the implications of using human test subjects a little more deeply. So from our modern perspective, poison trials on humans were obviously horrific. And it would be easy for us to assume from these accounts that in the 16th century, you could just do whatever horrible things you wanted to human beings without a problem. Poison trials appeared to show this, and to some extent that was true, but it was also much more complicated than that. So my fourth chapter focuses on a pattern I began to notice when I was reading through all of these really horrific trial accounts, which was really surprising to me. So in most poison trials, condemned criminals were presented as giving their consent to the poison trial. So it's mentioned that the test subject agreed to take the poison. This was not true in the initial test of Caravita's oil that I mentioned, but in basically all the other ones I found, the prisoner's consent is mentioned. Second, these trials are presented as taking place for the public good, or it's often presented as for the good of all Christendom. And finally, prisoners were almost always set free if they survived, or in certain instances in which prisoners were particularly violent prisoners, they were often given a mitigated sentence if they survived. So all three of these I found really interesting, because I was surprised that there was sort of any thought about this at all. And it's also particularly interesting because the first two items of the Nuremberg Code, created after World War II, listed both the idea of consent and the public good as two principles for testing drugs. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of historical distance between these two, but that these issues were even coming up as things that were mentioned in the 16th century was really surprising to me. My 16th century poison trials took place a long time before any formal medical ethics. So the term medical ethics did not even exist at the time. And I think we can all agree that today they would be considered extremely unethical. So I was asking why the focus on consent and public good, and why the reward of setting surviving prisoners free. So luckily, to answer this question, I had a really good case to help me. So the original case I found back in that Hohenlohe archive brought these two issues into focus really explicitly. So this trial was a very fascinating case. It described how in December of 1580, a man named Wendel Tümler stole a coin from another patron in a tavern in a village near the castle city of Langenburg. He was caught red-handed, marched down the river, and thrown into the dungeon in Langenburg Castle. He was questioned the next day and initially confessed to just a couple of minor misdeeds, but eventually he was tortured, and under torture, he confessed to 74 counts of thievery, most of them horse thefts, which was a significant crime at the time. You can see how in the margins, the notaries actually tried to verify many of his confessions. They didn't just believe him out of hands, and some of them they actually noted that they couldn't have happened because the person wasn't missing anything. But there were enough ones that they verified that it was enough to condemn him to death by hanging. But there was much more to this conviction that met the eye. From the beginning of this case, the local prince, Wolfgang II of Hohenlohe, had his eye on Tümler as a subject to test the Silesian Terra Sigillata that Andreas Berthold was selling. And there's a whole side story about Count Wolfgang really driving the use of torture in this case. So this poison antidote was the same one I just mentioned at the end of this last chapter, which Wolfgang's mother had purchased, as we had heard. So his mother was the one who had gotten this quantity of drug. And he explicitly mentions this in the documentation, that our dear mother has obtained this, and that they both wished to see if the antidote worked as well on humans as on animals. So the issue of human-animal transfer came into explicit focus here. So it seemed likely that Wolfgang was on the lookout for a potential human test subject, and Wendell Thümler entered this at a particular time. But his counselors were concerned about using, first of all, about the whole issue of torturing Thümler to start with, and then about how to best use him for this test of the poison antidote. And particularly concerned was his trusted advisor, whose name was Zacharias Huso. Huso worried that there would be unrest among the peasantry if Thümler was either seen to be coerced into the test, or if Thümler took the antidote, survived, and then the peasants had to accept a hardened criminal back into their midst. So Huso specifically frames this as a concern about unrest among the peasantry, whom he called foolhardy, so they don't come off well in his estimation. And he's worried about how this will look. Huso lived in Neuenstein rather than Langenburg, so his letters back and forth with Wolfgang are preserved. And this back and forth gave me some actual perspective on what might have been going on behind the scenes in poison trials. It demonstrated that the use of human bodies for poison testing was not as straightforward as it seemed. And I saw lots of echoes of this in other sources, but this source laid it out explicitly. So Huso and Wolfgang's other advisors agreed that Wolfgang could proceed with a poison trial, but that it had to be done with great care. And they wrote a really careful document that explained exactly how things should proceed. And it's written like a play, giving everyone their part. So they said that a third party should go to Thümler and tell him that Count Wolfgang had an antidote to poison that he wanted to test. And that person should suggest that Thümler go to the legal authorities and offer himself as a test subject. And he should make it clear that he was doing it, and this is a direct quote, out of his own free will, without any tricks or force, also without being convinced or told to do it. So here it really spells out in great detail that he had to feel like he's doing this on his own free will. And once he did this, Count Wolfgang should at first appear reluctant. Given his terrible crimes, he should be reluctant to let him off from his execution. But he should then relent and agree to do it because the medicine would come to the benefit of so many God-fearing people. And this point is reiterated like 3 times, the good, pious, God-fearing people it would save. So this makes very explicit that these 2 points are really important. But why? Why are they important? So really quickly, I have 2 answers to that question. First is that doing a poison trial was an interruption to the very important ritual of execution at the time. So execution was an important both religious and cultural ritual, as well as being an instrument of justice. It was supposed to deter other criminals while also guiding the condemned to a good death. In Catholic thought, the condemned could get time off purgatory or even skip purgatory entirely if he was penitent and in the right way with God at the moment of execution. For Protestants, a criminal could go to heaven if he believed in Jesus in his final moments. So from the point of view of the public, it also punished a dangerous criminal and kept him out of society. So to interrupt these things was a really big deal, and it needed good justification. And then secondly, poison was viewed as a sneaky, scurrilous crime, and it was something princes did not want to be associated with. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, princes often accused each other of being poisoners as an insult. So it was seen as something that's really not a good thing. So there is this famous Lorenzetti fresco in Siena that personifies bad government as a devil tyrant holding a cup of poison. So poison's really associated with tyranny and also with sneakiness, and not something princes want to be attached to them. So in the end, the answer to these potential problems was showing that there was a proper procedure in place. So this is very German bureaucratic that it's spelled out so explicitly, but this is also appears in a bunch of the other poison trials I saw. So Tumler had to be shown to consent without any coercion. The public good was emphasized, and he was promised freedom, although in this case, he was banished rather than executed. And incidentally, we do have a separate account of this from our old friend Andreas Berthold. He published an account of this poison trial as well, which basically just follows, the report follows the script that Wolfgang's counselors let out. So it's basically written as if, the script had been followed. Tumler did survive. He was banned from coming within 10 miles of Langenburg. His parents just took him home. So this obviously helped the concerns about the criminal going back into the society. In any case, this is obviously not the kind of medical ethics based on human dignity and justice like we have today, but it was an attempt to negotiate the problem of using human bodies for medical research. And I found it very interesting that there was even this kind of negotiation. So that, I think with that, I'm at about an hour. So I think I will stop talking and say thank you. And I know there's a lot more I could talk about, but I look forward to addressing any questions in the Q&A. So thanks very much for letting me share this with you. And I'm going to stop my screen share so that I can see people's faces.
Okay. Alisha, many thanks for that talk and expertly guiding us through these poison trials and their history. Absolutely fascinating. Can I just start the ball rolling by saying that Berthold was very, very efficient at advertising the Terra strigensis, because when you look at 18th century, particularly materia medica cabinets, it's the most highly represented cake of Terra sigillata you find, apart from Terra lemnia. I just wondered if you had been to Striga and if there was any remains of the workings for this, because there must have been a huge amount actually produced. And is there any sign of it historically in the area today?
I was not able to travel to Striga for which is now Strzeżum in Poland for this. I really wanted to, but it just didn't work out with everything coming from the States. But I do know from doing research that the mine that produced the Terra sigillata collapsed in the early 19th century. So at some point, I mean, this was a huge part of the economy of this town. You're right. If you go to any pharmacy museum, it's full of these little, medallions of Terra sigillata. And as part of the research for this, I went to the Basel Pharmacy Museum, which has a huge amount of it. And they were so excited that I was excited about it, because mostly people are like, what are these little pieces of dirt? But I was really, really excited to see them. So this was a huge part of the city's economy, and then the mines collapsed and the whole industry collapsed after that. So I think that there is not a lot. The most I could find is there's a plaque Berthold marketed this in Western Europe, but it was said to have been discovered by a Paracelsian physician named Johannes Montanus, who lived in Spiga. And there's a plaque to him apparently in the town center. But I wrote to the Breznik archives, which would have been responsible for Striga, and they said they lost most of the materials in the war that would have been covered this. So I had that was a part of this I was really interested in that I didn't get to follow up as much as I would have liked to.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got several questions in the chat bar. George Gomez asks, whenabouts in history did clinical trials begin, presumably replacing the sorts of poison trials that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so that's much later. So, 20th century. So this is really, very early inklings, and I'm not making any sort of claim that these resemble modern RCTs, because that's a completely different thing. But it's just sort of like the early sense that that doing some kind of actual testing is worthwhile and important.
Lovely, thank you. And Jeanette asked, did anyone have the opportunity to test the antidote oils directly against plague? as it could also be claimed to cure that. And did
Well,
charlatans use similar cures?
yeah. So they, in many cases, these antidotes were actually used against plague. So so we know that Carabitas oil was first used against plague, and I should say, when I say used, from the modern perspective, it's likely that none of these would have cured poison or plague, certainly. But I'm sort of using actors categories and say, and when it's reported, is viewed at the time to have been effective against plague. And then Landgrave Wilhelm IV of Hesse-Kassel, who did the series of extensive experiments on dogs, he actually did that in the middle of a plague epidemic. And there's reports of his attempts to kind of send Terra sigillata to various villages in his regions to use for plague. And there was a big crunch trying to buy the Terra sigillata because so many princes were interested in trying to buy it up because there was this plague epidemic at the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Gemma asked, what herbs were boiled in the oil? I presume Carabitas oil. Is it detailed in your book?
No, Matilde gives this recipe. I'm trying to remember what the herbs are. It's mostly not herbs. It's things like theriac and Terra sigillata, and it's a lot of other poison antidotes that are boiled, like existing ones that are boiled along with the scorpions. And I think there are a couple of herbs, but I don't remember which ones.
Okay. And Jeanette says, presumably those prisoners that consented to take part in the trials had actually been condemned to death. Otherwise, yes, it wouldn't have been worth them taking part.
Oh yes. That's a thing I should have made clear. Yes, these are only prisoners who are already condemned to death. So they're going to be executed anyway, and it's just the method of potential execution. So that's why setting them free is quite a big deal, because they'll be let off the sentence of execution, which was extremely rare. So it was very, very, very unusual to let someone off the execution sentence.
Yeah. And Bryony says it's interesting to reflect on the ongoing centrality of prisoners to the trials of new and/or risky substances, with later resonance, of course, for other trials like that for smallpox vaccines in the early 18th century.
Yes, I'm actually working on a article right now on the sort of long history of using criminals as test subjects into the 18th century. And I would like to make this into a book, actually, into the 20th century, because it's an interesting group as test subject. I mean, there are lots of large vulnerable groups used as test subjects, orphans, military populations, hospital patients at the time who tended to be very poor. But prisoners are interesting because they're viewed as owing a debt back to society. So there is an interesting moral aspect of the use of prisoners. And because a lot of them are condemned criminals, there is less concern about what they're actually doing to their bodies.
There's a couple of comments in the chat section about the origins of Bezoar, but the answers are already in there in responses. So I'll move on to Tony Cartwright's comment that there's a rationale for the use of clays such as Terra sigillata, which will absorb toxic materials. Kaolin and attapulgite are commonly used in treating diarrhea. And I can also add there that there have been trials that show that these things have antibacterial properties as well.
Yeah, the Terra sigillata is the one that the most modern research has been done of any of these substances, and seems to show some effects, and which is interesting from my perspective, because that's the one that was the most effective. Of the ones that seemed to work, that one definitely seemed the most effective.
Yeah. And Maggie says, how do the scorpions work in these antidotes? What's the idea behind that, including the scorpions?
Oh, so the intellectual idea is that they're they're considered a poisonous animal. So it's sort of like defanging the poison to use it as part of the antidote, which you find a lot in poison antidotes. So theriac, for example, used the flesh of venomous snakes. So there was sort of the connection between venom and anti-venom is very close there.
Yeah, so it's a principle of sympathy, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
And Peter says, did any of these antidotes actually work? And if not, what means, if not, wait, did any of them actually work?
Well, so I think you've handily helped answer that question, Chris, by mentioning the Terra sigillata. So Terra sigillata is the one that may work. I think there's been very little research done on any others. There is no indication why any of the other ones would work. I mean, the Caravitas oil was an external application. It had very strong religious resonances, so it was anointed in the same way that holy oil might be anointed. So I think it's hard to imagine how that would have worked from a modern perspective. But again, this is like, it's about the power it's giving to the princes more than about what it actually did, that I was interested in looking in this book.
Mm-hmm. Maria makes the comment that there were some medical ethics from Hippocrates onwards where physicians shouldn't give deadly medicines to their patients. They shouldn't give abortifacients, for example.
Yes, exactly, which is interesting in this case because physicians are giving poison to their patients. So I find that's which, the Hippocratic Oath was well known. It was not sworn in the 16th century the way it is in modern medical schools, at least in the United States. But yeah, no, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah. And Greg Higby notes that asked rather, did any of the prisoners who died from the poisons actually wind up in the hands of the anatomists?
That's a great question. So interestingly, the ones that I have looked at don't seem to have been intended for being dissected afterwards, because a lot of them took place in the summer, which was not the time for anatomical dissections. When they did dissections, it tended to be in the winter so that the bodies would stay, okay for longer. And that's very interesting. And there is one case in which Cosimo de' Medici gave the anatomist Gabriele Falloppio, known for naming the fallopian tubes, a prisoner to do what he wanted with, and Falloppio experimented with different quantities of opium and eventually gave him a fatal dose and died, and he dissected it. So he was basically given this prisoner to dissect, and the Cosimo basically said, kill him however you want. And this was, but that was not testing an antidote. That was like the aim for that was dissection. I didn't find any cases, at least in the more detailed trials, in which the prisoner was dissected. There were a couple of ones early on in which they dissected the prisoner to see, after he died, the ones where they died, they dissected them to see what the insides looked like, what the effects of the poison were. So there were at least one, if not two, cases in which that did happen.
Okay, thanks. And Ed Wawrinczak says, as well as detailed reports, did the procedures involve give importance to having witnesses present at the trials?
So I think that I'm trying to think of that question, actually. I don't remember seeing any emphasis on having witnesses per se, except that it's true that several people would sign them. So it's possible that, yes, having, multiple signatures there was important. So the signatures of whoever was there, which was usually the physician, one or two physicians, and almost always an apothecary as well, would sign their names. But that could either be just a marker of authority, or it could be witnessing. So like putting their medical authority behind it is more how I read it. But it could also, having multiple witnesses could be important. But it certainly wasn't something, the number of witnesses was not something that was emphasized in the accounts.
Okay, I seem to remember that Olive Wurm actually had 4 witnesses for testing unicorn horn at his local apothecary shop. Yeah. And he calls them witnesses, as far as I remember. So,
he calls them witnesses. Okay, yeah. His was a little bit later than I was looking. That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's 17 new messages come up. There's no way we're going to be able to get through all this. I'll ask a couple more questions, but can I direct people perhaps to your webpage at the university if they want to follow up on some of this?
Oh, please do. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. So you've emphasised Princely Court, says Stephen Johnson, as a particularly prominent venue for the poison trials, while underlying that the physicians differentiated themselves from empirics by their learned practice. Is there an echo in contemporary university circles, or is the courtly context separate?
I think the courtly, I hope the courtly context is quite different from today. I'd like to think so. Yeah.
Is there a sense, says Charlotte, that imported ingredients were better for poison than native ones?
there's an exotic element of it that, yes, absolutely. That's a really strong association throughout the book, that some of these exotic, either exotic imported ones coming from afar, or ones created by alchemists that also had a certain amount of exoticism to them, were the most common ones that were tested.
Well, I'll perhaps finish with this last question, because this will lead nicely onto your next book, and just remind people to get in touch with Alisha. If you go to the Tufts University website, you'll be able to find her email address there. But Maggie says, please tell us how your research for this ties in with the witchcraft theme of your new book.
Yes. Well, so part of this, so this also ties into, I see Gemma's question about whether they only tested men, which the answer to that is yes, because the condemned criminals were almost all men, that especially the ones for theft, which is the thing they were most commonly condemned of. But I was realizing in this that it sounds really interesting that there's this very male-centered world of looking at poison antidotes, when poison was very strongly attached to women at the time, and women in witchcraft. So I was asked to write an article about gender and poison antidotes, and realized that there is a much stronger association with women as poisoners and men with healing poison. So a lot of these antidotes tied to princes are tied to princes. A lot of the antidotes that are tied to a person is tied to sort of a powerful man. So that kind of got me interested in the question of poison and witchcraft, which has turned into this really fascinating poison. That's sort of my entry into this, is the very close connection between poison and witchcraft, which is sort of something that is reiterated time and again. So I'm really at the beginning parts of this. But poison and witchcraft are really linked, both legally as crimes, but also metaphorically. This is something that's a very close tie.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, we look forward to the next book and perhaps the next lecture to follow up on that, if we can invite you again. Thank you so much, Alisha, for your time.
Thank you very much.
Your expertise.
Thank you for such interesting questions. This was really fun.
So can I just remind everybody that details concerning our programme of lectures are available on the website and can be booked through links on Eventbrite. Our next talk will consider the uses of emeralds in the history of medicine and will take place on Monday, the 21st of February. If you've attended any of our online lectures before, you should automatically receive notification of upcoming ones via Eventbrite, as we said. But alternatively, keep an eye on the website, where we regularly update details of our planned talks with appropriate links for advanced booking and so on. Now, I'm sorry about we had a bit of a glitch with recording on YouTube, so that's why we suddenly started recording on Zoom partway through. So I apologize for the interruption to Alisha and also to listeners, but we will make it available. We got most of it. I think it's just perhaps 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning that we're missing. So thank you all very much for coming and for all your expressions of thanks to Alisha. Lots and lots there, which I'm sure you'll be able to read. And we look forward to seeing you all again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.